Good morning, everyone, and thank you for attending our event today. Today's webinar is led by our FRAS Director, Chetan Hans. It will be about 1 hour, and including some time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. If you have any questions, please leave them in our chat box by clicking Q&A button on your Zoom display, and we will address them at the end of the presentation. We also have a few polls throughout the presentation, so please keep an eye out for them. Thank you. Director Chetan.
All right, thanks, Tony. Hi, good morning, everyone. So just to kind of give you a brief introduction, I'm Chetan Hans, and I lead the service line called Financial Reporting Advisory Services in Grant Thornton, Singapore. And essentially what we do as part of this is help clients with financial reporting issues or problems. So we provide them with end-to-end solutions from how to account for a transaction, so all the way through to its presentation in the balance sheet, discussion with the auditors, as well as disclosure related issues. So we've been helping our clients across a spectrum of issues in the recent years: revenue recognition, financial instruments, leases, to name a few. So today's topic, liability or equity. So before we start, I think we'll do a short poll just to kind of gauge how many of you have actually dealt with scenarios where your clients have raised funds privately. So the whole objective of today's session is to kind of look at some of the private fundraisers, the clauses that we typically see, and how the accounting for them could differ from what you would have thought from a legal perspective. A classic example being preference shares. A simple redeemable preference shares is considered as an equity under the Companies Act or under the legal framework. However, the accounting answer could be different depending upon what rights and obligations are factored in those preference shares. So maybe I'll give you a couple of seconds to answer this poll question, and then we'll proceed with the next slides in the session. All right, so as I said earlier, the session's going to focus primarily on FRS 32, liability or equity. The key thing to note is that this is not a new standard. It's been there for a while. It's been there for a long time now. However, in our experience, we still see people, even accountants, get the accounting wrong when it comes to accounting for certain financial instruments. And the reason being is that FRS 32 lays out detailed rules defining what equity should be and what liability should be. And between these two extreme positions of an equity or a pure liability, there are a lot of hybrid contracts, which I'll try to cover as much as possible. So, and given the fact that the way the market has evolved in the last few years, especially since we see a lot more companies starting up new businesses, coming up with innovative ideas, excuse me, and raising funds privately. I mean, there has been a sea change of how the fundraise used to happen maybe 10 to 15 years back compared to how it's been happening in the last 5 to 6 years. And that's where the complexity has increased. Depending upon what stage in your fundraise you are, there could be different types of clauses. So for example, there could be convertible features, there could be options, there could be features which increase or decrease your cash flows depending upon certain events like IPOs. And it really depends on how the two parties have negotiated that fundraise. Typically, these are private equity VC type deals. It could also be a angel dip. So as I said, it would really depend on what stage the company is in its life cycle, and the complexity really depends on how sophisticated the financial investor is with whom you're dealing. Some of the common areas, as I mentioned earlier, convertible debentures or a bond, convertible or redeemable preference shares. So the legal form for a bond is it's a liability, and for a preference shares is it's shareholders fund. However, the accounting can be either. So if it's a plain vanilla redeemable preference shares, for instance, which have to be redeemed after a point in time, it's a straight liability under FRS 32. And I'll explain in the subsequent slides as to how we make that determination. The key thing that we need to kind of take away from this standard and from this session is that FRS 32 considers the substance. You need to really understand if there is an obligation for me to pay, or or for your client has, if your client has an obligation to pay at any given point in time. It may not be fixed at the inception, it could be contingent upon events, but if there's an obligation, the chances are it's going to be liability. Now, why this could be a deal breaker for some, because if you're already leveraged and you're going in for, let's say you are a mid-sized company, you have bank loans and you want to expand, and you do a deal with a private equity or a VC, or a family office, and they invest in some of these instruments, which are then determined to be liability, which you initially thought would be equity, that could potentially breach your covenants on the loans that you have from the banks, which could trigger immediate repayment. It could trigger the call option, or the repayable on demand feature in the loan. So I think that's where it becomes important to kind of look at all these features in more detail and determine the appropriate accounting treatment. As I said, the typical clauses that we look out for, so dividend or interest rights, whether it's a mandatory periodic dividend or interest payable, whether it's discretionary, whether it's contingent upon occurrence of a certain event. Now, dividend in common parlance means it's on equity, right? You have equity shares and you pay dividend on that. But if you have a contract with an investor where you say, okay, I'm going to pay you dividend of 5% every quarter for the next 10 years, hypothetically. Now that's where you have actually undertaken a liability. Why? Because you're obliged to pay that dividend to that investor over a certain period of time. Now this instrument may or may not have a redemption, but it has a dividend feature which is debt-like. So now you have an instrument which has an equity-like feature and a debt-like feature, and that's why evaluation becomes appropriate. I'm sorry, not appropriate. It becomes important to determine an appropriate accounting treatment. Now, what happens if dividend is considered to be a liability? The first thing is that it is not then shown as a appropriation. So typically, any dividend that you pay in ordinary shares, it goes through your statement of changes in equity and is shown as an appropriation. It doesn't affect your profit. But if it becomes interest, or it becomes a liability because of which it is classified as interest, now it becomes a P&L charge. So your profitability also takes a hit. While it may not impact your EBITDA, which is earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, and amortization, but your overall profit after tax may reduce. The other is redemption rights. Again, whether it's mandatorily redeemable at investor's discretion, or redeemable at issuer's discretion. Now, these three clauses will make a lot of difference, whether it's an equity, whether it's a liability, or it's something in between. So we're going to discuss in the next few slides how do we approach such an evaluation? And there are a couple of case studies to kind of walk you through that evaluation. Just one thing I'll probably like to highlight. These things are constantly evolving. So, as the business models become more complex, the financial models have also become more complex. So the examples that I show you are probably the most common ones we've seen in our experience in the last few years. However, there could be more complex structures in the market, which may require some professional help. Right. So moving on to the next slide, I think this is the most critical one, exit clauses. So, a lot of times you may even have an ordinary shares which give you a right to participate in the management. You have board representation. You may have a dividend right, which is discretionary, but you may have exit clauses which allow you to exit at your discretion by giving a notice to the company. So it's like a put option that you hold. Now, a put option, so the existence of a put option can raise a big question mark on the classification of an ordinary shares as equity, even though it's ordinary. It meets all the features of an ordinary shares, and it is equity in the common parlance. So I think that's an area where a lot of thought has to be given as to what those exit rights are, when can they be exercised, who has the right to exercise those, and then determine whether you have a liability or an equity position. Related to exit clauses, there are also conversion rights. So again, conversion rights is generally where you have convertible instruments. Again, in scenarios where you have private capital raise, convertible instruments, optionally convertible preference shares or optionally convertible debentures are very common. Now here, the accounting would really pivot on one determination, uh, and that is what is the conversion ratio. The conversion ratio, this is what we call as a fixed for fixed test, which really means if there's a fixed amount of cash being converted into fixed number of shares. So if the value of your instrument is fixed, so if you are a Singapore based company, you issue a Singapore dollar instrument and you say that after 5 years it converts into equity shares of $1 each, your ratio is fixed. You don't need to think more about it. However, if you issue a US dollar instrument with a fixed ratio, then you don't meet the fixed for fixed criteria because the amount of cash is varying. It varies based on the US dollar and Singapore dollar rate. And the other scenario could be that you have a fixed amount, but the ratio is variable. And that scenario, there's certain other accounting nuances. So I think we need to look at the contractual terms in a lot of details. Typically, in a financing agreement of this nature, you will have things on exit rights, you'll have clauses on regular return, whether it's dividend or interest. You may have conversion issues, you may have tag along rights. All of these require an evaluation. You may even have anti-dilution rights, which may require evaluation for a debt equity classification. So just because your contract says it's a preference shares, it doesn't necessarily mean it's equity. It may or may not, and that's what we're going to discuss in the next few slides as to how to approach this evaluation. Obviously, in the 1 hour we will not be able to cover the entire standard, but the idea is to give you enough to kind of look at the key clauses and basically make a determination. Okay, this is something which doesn't look like an equity or doesn't look like an debt. And if there are obviously more complex areas, then you may actually require professional help either from an outside consultant or maybe someone else. I think put options and anti-dilutive clauses I've already covered, so I'll be dealing with the accounting evaluation for these in more detail. So yeah, I think with this we can probably move into the actual the theory of FRS 32. But before we do that, we have another poll question just to kind of gauge understanding as to how many of you have really seen and experienced such issues at your companies or maybe at your clients. Right. So maybe we can have the results of the poll, please. Right. So I see a lot of people have actually faced some issues related to some of these instruments. Good. So I think you'll probably be able to appreciate this a lot more. So the accounting for financial instruments. So the accounting for financial instrument under FRS or IFRS is largely spread over 3 accounting standards. FRS 32, which deals with classification of financial instruments. So this is the standard which kind of defines what a financial instrument is, what a financial asset, financial liability, equity, and then how do you determine what is equity and what is a liability. The next standard is FRS 109, which establishes the principles for recognition and measurement. So once you have identified what is debt, what is equity, what is financial asset, how do you recognize it? At what value do you recognize it? And what do you do after day one? So there is accounting on day one, and then there is subsequent accounting. So that all is defined under FRS 109. And there are detailed rules on the recognition and measurement principles. FRS 109 also includes a separate topic called hedge accounting, which is only relevant if you undertake hedging activities. And then last is FRS 107, which gives detailed guidance on disclosures as to what you need to disclose. So in your financial statements, the typical disclosures you see on credit risk, interest rate risk, price risk, etc., all that essentially comes from FRS 107. For today's session, we are going to be focusing on FRS 32. Should any of you have any questions related to 109 or 107, you can reach out to us separately and we'll be more than happy to help you out with that. Right, so definition of equity. So the standard defines equity as a contract that evidences a residual interest in net assets of an entity. What this really means is that, in simple terms, what is left after paying everyone else. So if a company has to be liquidated or the winding up has to be initiated, the guys who are left last in the line after everyone else is paid, they are the equity holders. So ordinary shares, share warrants, and mandatory preference shares are common examples of contracts which are equity. Another important thing is it has to arise from a contractual. That's the contractual arrangement, which is the key element of the definition of financial instrument as well. That it has to be contractual in nature. It needs to arise from a contract. For most of the fundraising, there is a contractual evidence, so we really don't need to worry about it. But I think that's something I wanted to emphasize upon. So elaborating on this, why on this equity liability distinction, why does it matter? So as I said earlier, it matters because if it's equity and it's determined to be a liability, so legally it's been issued as an equity instrument, but then you determine it to be a liability, it can have a significant impact on your loan covenants, on your gearing ratios, on your overall business plan and your funding plan for the business. Because let's say you were in the process of raising funds through a private equity or a VC, and you thought this would be equity and subsequent rounds would be debt. Now, if this is classified as a liability, your subsequent debt financing plans may have to be revised, or you may find difficulty because the banks whom you'll approach will ask you a lot of questions on these obligations, which you probably did not think about earlier. The second element is initial measurement and subsequent measurement. So, if it's a liability, it's shown as a debt. The interest will be shown as interest in expense. So even if it's a dividend, it will be shown as an interest expense. And then in certain circumstances, liabilities may be fair value through P&L. A common example of that is an instrument which has been issued where the holder has been given a right to put at the fair market value at the date of the exercise. So a lot of the PE VC contracts that we've seen in our recent experience had exit options for the investor, which allowed them to exit from the business at the market value determined at the date they exercise that option. What this really means is that you have an obligation to pay the company, because if the investor asks for the money back, you have to pay. So you can't really avoid that payment. And the second is, what is the value of that obligation? Now, since that value is linked to the fair market value of the business, it keeps on increasing. So the better your business does, the value of the liability keeps on increasing. And that increase in the value also is a charge to your P&L, because that's how it works. It's not a repayment, it's not a buyback, it's a pure increase in value. So the debit side will go to your P&L as sort of finance charges. And the last element obviously is the treatment of payments and repurchases, because when it's equity, all these payments and repurchases go through statement of changes in equity. In case of liabilities, a bulk of these would go through the P&L, the interest and the fair value changes. It's only the actual repayment which is a balance sheet movement. It's a balance sheet transaction, doesn't affect your P&L. So on day one, when let's take an example, on day one, if you raise funds which has a put option at $100, after 5 years, you expect the put option to be exercised by the holder after 5 years. So during the 5 years, it balloons from $100 to $500. Every year, you would charge something to your P&L, so your liability goes up to 500, and after the 5th year you pay 500. So only that payment of 500 is something that will not affect your P&L. Rest everything's going to affect your P&L. So it has a significant impact on your balance sheet and a significant impact on your P&L as over the period of time. So going into the details of the equity liability classification, there are conditions which one would need to evaluate. And the first one is there is no obligation to deliver cash or other financial asset or to exchange financial assets and liability. So what really means is there will be no scenario whatsoever in which you can be required to pay something. You don't have an obligation to pay. So again, going back to my example of the put option, when the put option is with the holder, the investor, can you say you have no obligation? Unlikely, because holder can exercise that put option and ask you to pay the money. However, if you have that option that you determine when the instrument has to be redeemed or instrument has to be repurchased, then you can potentially avoid payment forever. If you don't exercise that option, you don't have to pay. It's like a buyback in an ordinary share. So unless and until you really exercise that buyback option, there is no obligation to pay. So in those scenarios, since there's no obligation, it will be classified as an equity. Now for the second criteria is for convertibles, where a fixed amount of cash is exchanged for a fixed number of equity shares. This is for convertible instruments. Now again, there can be various permutation combinations over here, whether it's an optionally convertible instrument or whether it's a mandatorily convertible instrument. So if it's a mandatorily convertible instrument where it's a fixed amount of cash and fixed number of equity instrument, it will be liability. And if it's a mandatorily convertible instrument with a variable ratio, it will be a liability. And I'll explain you in the next slide why it becomes a liability. The optionally convertibles are slightly more complex because they have both equity and a liability feature. So if it's an optionally convertible instrument with a fixed ratio, this is what we call as a compound instrument under the accounting standards, which really means you split the equity and the liability portion. Equity portion goes into your equity stockholders' equity, and the liability portion is shown as a current or a non-current liability, as the case may be, and then it accrues interest. When the ratio is variable, then it is a liability with an embedded derivative. And in most of these cases, we've seen companies recognizing the entire instrument at fair value. And I'm going to explain why this conversion ratio makes a lot of difference. What is the economic rationale behind it? But before that, I think the key message from this slide is that, if does the entity have an unavoidable contractual obligation, meaning can you avoid payment to any obligation? If you can't avoid, then you have a liability. So, and if you can, then it's an equity. So if it's, I think that's a very simplified and a layman way to look at it, that, if I don't have to pay ever, then it's not a liability, it's an equity. Yeah, so examples of liability, the obligations to pay cash could come from either interest or redemption, or a combination of those. It may or may not be the exact same thing. Mandatory redemption at the end of tenure. Examples of equity, as I said earlier, could be ordinary shares, where you don't have any committed payment. You don't have to redeem the ordinary shares. These dividends are completely discretionary. You would declare dividend only when you have profits. There are no put options. There is nothing fancy in an ordinary share. So that's traditionally the ordinary shares that have been issued. So that's equity. Now, condition 2, which was fixed amount of cash for fixed. So I'll explain that with help of an example. So we have a case where we have preference shares which have been issued for $1 million. The face value of the preference shares and equity share is $100 a share. Now, in scenario 1, they have to be converted into equity shares at a ratio of 1:1 at maturity. Now, if you look at the slide on the table below, which shows scenario 1, when in scenario 1, when you convert, you get 10,000 shares for by converting it into the preference shares into equity. The value of the shares on the day of conversion is 80. So the value of my equity is 800,000. I invested 1 million, but I'm getting 800,000. And similarly, I know 100, if the value is 100, the value of equity shares received is $1 million. And in the third case, it's 1.2 million. So what this shows is the investor has the equity risk. So if the value of the shares increases or decreases, the company doesn't have to compensate the investor for that. It's a risk that he or she has taken. And that's why it is equity, because if you're an equity investor, you take risk in the moment of the value of the company. You take risk in the net assets of the company. And that's what the fixed for fixed rule that we discuss tries to capture. That if it's a fixed for fixed, then what you have done is effectively the number of shares you're going to get on the date when you enter into the transaction, and on that date and from that date any changes in the value would accrue to the investor. It doesn't accrue to the company. Now, second scenario, it's based on the ratio is based on market price. So the contract says that the ratio will be determined when the conversion happens. So again, taking the example, the $80 market value, we get 12,500 shares. What this really means is that I have effectively guaranteed or underwritten the $1 million investment the investor has made, right? Because at any given point in time, he will get shares worth $1 million. So he doesn't take any equity risk. Yes, he does have credit risk, which any liability would have. So let's hypothetically, if the company was to go under, then he will not recover the $1 million, but then it's a credit risk, it's not equity risk. So any movement in the value of the shares, I compensate him by giving additional or lesser shares. So in either of the three scenarios, $80, $100, $120, the value of the shares that the investor receives is 1 million. Now, in real life, this would probably also factor in some return, the IRR that the investor targets. So you would typically have a formula which would define how this conversion ratio would be determined. And that formula generally would have a return factored in. So maybe this 1 million becomes 1.2 million, and then you apply the market value on the day of conversion to determine the number of shares. And that's why in the first scenario where the ratio is fixed, it is equity. In the second scenario where the ratio is variable, it's a liability. Now coming to the third type, which is compound instruments. So compound instruments, as I said, they are instruments which are features of both equity and liability. Now, these could be convertible instruments, optionally convertible instruments, where you have an option to convert. So if it's a mandatorily convertible, it will either be equity or it will either be debt. If it's an optionally convertible, then it can be either. Now, typically when you meet the fixed for fixed criteria in this, you will have an instrument which has an equity component and a liability component. And the way we calculate the two components is that we calculate the present value of all the cash flows, using a rate that we would have paid if there was no conversion option. So let's say if it's a 5-year instrument, $1 million is the value. And the rate of interest in this is, let's say, 0.5%, but it has a conversion option at the end of 5 years. Now, if you would have taken a same loan of the same value, same tenure, but without conversion option, the bank would have charged you, let's say, 4%. So we discount the cash flows of this instrument at 4%. Let's say that the discounted value comes to 800,000. So 1 million minus 800,000 is essentially your equity portion. That goes to your equity, 800,000 goes to your liability, and then you accrue interest on 800,000 at 4%. At the end of year 5, if it's converted, everything goes into share capital. So your liability would have gone up to $1 million. If it's share capital is issued, you will debit your liability and issue a share capital. If the liability is paid out, you will obviously debit the liability and credit your bank and pay that out. This was an example of a convertible debt, but you can also have examples where it's not convertible yet it has both equity and liability portions. So for instance, you have a redeemable instrument, but the dividends are discretionary. So in this case, you have a $1 million redeemable preference shares. There is no dividend in the interim because it's discretionary, and you have a bullet payment after 5 years. And then we just apply the same concept, discount it using a regular interest rate, and see what that value differential is, which we should allocate to equity. If the ratio, in case of convertibles, optionally convertibles, if the ratio is variable, then again it's a liability accounting. As I said, it is slightly more nuanced because it's a liability with an embedded derivative. But generally, companies choose an option of fair valuing the whole thing because it's much easier to kind of do the derivative and liability valuation. But again, that's up to the companies to decide. Now, in practice, you may have instruments which will definitely have more than one feature. They will have conversion options, they will have anti-dilutive features, they will have drag along rights, they will have tag along rights, they may even have put options. And that's what makes the entire evaluation more complex. That's why it's, as I said at the start of this session, it becomes really important to look at each of those clauses and see whether it gives rise to an obligation, and if there's a conversion feature, whether it's very fixed or variable. If it's an anti-dilutive clause, does it just maintain the status quo, or does it compensate it, the investor for with additional shares due to happening of one or more events? And this assessment is important because it can make a lot of difference whether it goes to the liability side or whether it goes to the equity side. So now for the next few slides, I'm going to walk you through a couple of examples so that we can apply the principles that we have learned on how to determine equity or liability. So the first scenario is you have a instrument which is not redeemable, and then within that you have payments of dividends as discretionary and non-discretionary. Now, if it's non-redeemable, I don't have a option, or I don't have an obligation to redeem. Now you combine that non-redeemable feature with the discretionary dividend, the entire thing becomes equity. Reason being, I don't have any obligation to pay. I will pay as and when I like. So I will pay dividends only when I think business has enough profits, and I cannot be compelled to pay anything to the company. Now, but when you combine this non-redeemable with a non-discretionary dividend, then the whole instrument becomes a liability, because it's like having an obligation to pay dividends in perpetuity. So the entire instrument will become liability. Thankfully, in practice, we don't see the second example a lot. It's not that common. But yeah, from a theoretical point of view, if you have a non-redeemable instrument with a non-discretionary payment of dividend, it will be a liability. The second scenario is it's a mandatorily redeemable instrument. If it's discretionary, so when I say mandatorily redeemable, there is a period at which at the end of which you would have to redeem it. You have to pay it back, and in this case, it's a fixed redemption amount. And you combine that with a discretionary dividend, then you have an instrument which is compound, because you have an equity feature related to dividends which are discretionary in nature, and you have a mandatorily redeemable instrument which has to be redeemed. A very common example of this would be redeemable preference shares, which have a fixed tenure, but the dividend is not discretionary. An important thing here to note is that, a lot of times these instruments may say that while the dividends are non-discretionary, but they are cumulative. That which really means is that if you don't pay dividend in 1 year, then it accumulates. So the moment you have cumulative preference shares, then you have non-discretionary, because you have to pay them. It's just, the timing has been deferred because legally you can't pay dividends because the company didn't have profits, and without profits under the Companies Act, you can't really I wouldn't say it can't, but it would be difficult to pay out dividends. So need to be careful about those things. What happens when it's a compound? We calculate the liability and equity components. The liability accrues interest, and essentially, at the end of the term, you square it off. When it's a mandatorily redeemable instrument with a non-discretionary dividend, then the entire thing again becomes a liability, because you have an obligation to pay both dividend as well as redemption, and the dividend shall be recognized in the profit and loss. It's basically interest. It's not dividend anymore. Now, for a lot of these things, you may also have to take tax positions, because tax may still treat it as dividend. So let's say you account for this dividend as interest, but you may not get a deduction for these deemed interest cost in your corporate income tax calculations. So wherever you have these scenarios, it's also important to take a tax position, consult it with your tax consultant to see how best you can optimize your tax. I think the third example is for redeemable preference shares. Redeemable preference shares with, and this is at issuer's option. When I say issuer's option, it means the company has the option to redeem it. So if the company has an option to redeem it, can I avoid payment forever? The answer is yes. So when I combine that with a discretionary dividend, the whole instrument becomes a equity. But where I have a redeemable preference shares with a non-discretionary dividend, then I have a liability, but I also have an embedded call option, essentially, which really means there is a value to the ability to call this debt. And typically, a liability, how will we calculate is that we will calculate the value of the liability and the option, and we will record them separately. Liability in its normal pattern would accrue interest. The call option would be a mark-to-market accounting. So let's say you have a instrument which is $1 million. You determine the value of the option to be 100,000, liability to be 900,000. So 900,000 will accrue interest till it becomes whatever the redemption amount is, and the 100,000 would be fair valued every year, so that there is it reflects the remaining value of the option. And to be honest, this is where you'll require again some valuation help to determine what that value is. Fair value movement between the two reporting dates is a charge to P&L. Redeemable at holder's option. Holder's option means it's the investor decides when it's redeemed. So it's redeemable at holder's option with discretionary dividend. It's a compound. Redeemable at holder's option and non-discretionary, it's a liability. And I think I'll probably just add on to this. In practice, such instruments redeemable at holder option with non-discretionary payments during the period do not have fixed value. The reason the investors generally put this clause is that they want to have an ability to get out of the company, but at the same time participate in the upside. So they would generally link it to a fair value exercise to be done when that option is exercised. They may even have caps and floors and all the different variations to these clauses to protect their interest, or it could be the way you've negotiated it to get a better deal. So it's important to look at whether it's whether it's redeemable and what value is it redeemable at. Because if it's redeemable at fair value, you will have to do a fair value exercise every reporting period and record the fair value changes in your P&L, which can be significant for companies which are in high growth phase. Typically, the revenues and the profits would not increase initially at the same pace as your values, because there is an underlying intangible which the startup, on basis which the startup is valued. It gets reflected in terms of revenues and profits and EBITDAs with some lag. So it may have a significant impact on your financials and your ability to raise further funds. I think there's a couple of examples that we have on the common clauses that we have seen, and how it should be evaluated under FRS 32 and what potential implications it can have. So once you've determined whether it's an equity or liability, the next step is you really go to FRS 109. Under FRS 109, you have, for liabilities, it can be either amortized cost or fair value through P&L. If it's a simple bank loan, it's going to be amortized cost, which really means you carry it at cost, you don't do anything. But whenever you have these more complex instruments which have a lot of these derivative type features, or which have features which causes a variability in the outflow, which may or may not be fixed, it may be contingent upon certain events, or it may be contingent upon a value at a future date. Generally, these liabilities would be carried at fair value. There are rules in 109 to determine how to do that. So again, important to assess whether you can carry it at cost or whether you carry it at fair value. And then the last would be the disclosures under FRS 107. I think with this we've covered most of what we wanted to. Maybe we can open the group for questions if you have any.
Shizin, the first question we have is, how does classification of such instruments affect the net worth of the company?
Right. So as I said earlier, the classification can have a significant impact on whether it's presented as an equity or a liability. So if it's equity, your net worth actually goes up. So your stockholders' equity or your shareholders' equity will show that additional fund infusion. So your net worth will go up. If it's a liability, the net worth will actually go down, because it's assets minus liabilities which gives you your net worth or your shareholders funds or shareholders equity. So if you're a business which has infused funds and you're looking to make your net worth positive because of a recent fundraise, and the accounting now says it's a liability, it can be a big spoil sport, because now your net worth's actually going to go worse because you've taken a instrument which is classified as a liability. Please mind it might be perfectly fine to have it to call it equity from a Companies Act perspective. It's only from an accounting perspective that we will call it as a liability, and there will be disclosures explaining why it's a liability. It might still be called preference shares, but it will appear in the liability section with appropriate notes explaining the whole transaction.
All right, next question. If preference shares are classified as a liability, does the dividend paid to such preference share can be classified in P&L like interest, and will be allowed as a deduction while arriving at income tax for the period like any other interest?
Correct. So if the preference shares are classified as liabilities, they will be the dividend on such preference shares will be interest. And as I said earlier during this course of the presentation, you will need to understand the tax position. So honestly, I'm not a tax expert, but my limited understanding is that it would probably be not considered as an interest expense, but it's a question better answered by someone who's a tax expert.
All right, next question. If my dividend clause is on profits and we do not foresee any profits anytime soon, in substance, is this still debt equity or just purely equity?
See, the point in this scenario, I think what you'll need to understand is that can there be a cumulative accumulation? So if your dividend obligation is based on profits, and if you don't pay dividend for a year and that right is lost, then yes, it's probably equity. But if it accumulates that for any year you're supposed to pay, you're not able to pay, but it accumulates till the point in time you have profits and you pay the entire amount when you have adequate profits, then it's a liability. So you really need to look at the terms and conditions and see whether you can avoid the payment or not. So I think the key thing to focus in whether you have an ability to avoid payment indefinitely. A deferral will not help you get away from liability position.
All right, next question. How is equity component of convertible instruments presented? Is it added to issued share capital?
That's a very good question. So typically, no, it is not. It is shown as a separate reserve. We typically call it like an equity component of a compound instrument. And the reason being, when you do kind of a split between liability and equity, we are not issuing actual shares. So the share capital in your financials shows actual issued, paid up, and allotted shares, which you can see in your BIS file and the ACRA filings. So till the point in time when actual shares are issued, we sort of carry it in a separate reserve in equity. It's only when the entire transaction is being settled, you can move things around and present it in share capital. But till that point, it's not shown as part of share capital.
All right, thank you, Chetan. That's all the questions we have.
All right. I think you have our contact details. So, if any one of you have any further questions, you can reach out to us and I think we'll be more than happy to help you with your questions.
All right. Thank you, Chetan. And thank you everyone for attending our webinar for today. We will upload this recording on our website by the end of today, and feel free to contact Chetan if you have any questions at all. Our next webinar will be on withholding tax, and it will be held on the 15th of October. So please look out for an invitation. If not, this is the end of today's session. Thank you very much for attending.
All right, thank you.